the research you are interested in. So what is research? We're going to start with the basics. And just a little bit of background about me. I teach a research methods graduate level course in a program called Research Evaluation Measurement and Statistics. We're in the College of Education. We're just a graduate program, but we teach all of the research methods and statistics courses in education in fields related to all the social sciences, really, and counseling and psychology and education. But everything that we do and what I love about statistics is that you can apply it to so many different fields, and a lot of things don't change, but the way that we apply it does. So it's pretty diverse in terms of how it can be used, and I think it's interesting to look at how it's been used over the, just the word itself in the past 200 years and how much we've increased in the research that we've done and the way people are using it. And I like this definition that it's studious inquiry or examination. And so I don't know if you consider yourself studious necessarily, but I hope that you do whenever you do research, because there's really a method behind what you're doing. And we don't just go out and do research, I think we should do this, or I feel like this is going to happen. But it really is a method or a procedure or process. There's a step-by-step method to the way that we need to do this in order for the results that you have to be used by other people, to be published in journals, which is a big goal that we have, is to get published. And so it really is important that we understand, know, and follow these different processes and procedures in research. So when we think of the big heading of research, there really are two kind of umbrellas that you might fall under. And there's a little gray area in the middle that some people might connect with, but typically you connect with one of these more than the other. So some people might be more quantitative. This is me. You focus on numerical data, things that you can actually measure. You can put a number to them. And we have this hypothesis, and then we want to test it. And we really follow this set of procedures like I was talking about. We typically have large samples, and we're dealing maybe with a lot of people or a lot of plants or a lot of trees or maybe in business or something like that. And then we can run some specific statistical analyses, make charts and graphs and things like that, but it really is kind of all number driven. Another framework is qualitative research, who your wonderful advisor back there gets excited about, just like I get excited about quantitative. And one's not better than the other, but they really do mesh well together when we compare them. But qualitative researchers not necessarily focused on the numbers, more of the narrative behind it. So instead of me giving you a survey and asking you to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 all of these different things, your advisor might put you together in focus groups and interview you and listen to you talk and how you talk and what types of words you're using and things like that. So while there is a process and a procedure to that, it's more developing along the way, and maybe you observe something, so you shift your focus a little bit and your hypothesis can change along the way. There still are types of analysis that are specific to qualitative research, but it's not quite so analytical like you might talk about it in the quantitative world. So how many people in here think that you fit more under the quantitative researcher side? Okay, and how many qualitative? Wow, we're almost exactly 50-50. But there is this, gray area in the middle where maybe a qualitative person will pair up with a quantitative person and we do a mixed method study. And we see the beauty in that because we get the descriptives, we get some straightforward black and white p-value analysis, but we also get to tell a story with it through our interviews and focus groups and things like that. So I like this little cartoon of two ideas of ice cream, and a quantitative method person might say only 1 in 30 take the free ice cream. That's interesting. Whereas a qualitative person would say, what did you feel when you saw free ice cream? How was that? We want to understand it a little bit more. maybe on a day like today, we want some free ice cream when we leave because it's hot, or maybe you did yesterday. I hear you had a good day. So these are, if you look up the scientific method, you probably studied it back in high school. It might be broken down into a number of different steps. What I've kind of composed here are 6 primary steps for the methodology of research, the whole start to finish. And so we'll talk about our introduction and our problem, the literature review, our question and our hypothesis, planning, data, results, and conclusion. And I do tend to talk more under the heading of quantitative research because that's typically what I do. But we'll throw in some things for the qualitative people out there as we go along. So the introduction and definition of the problem. As I go through and I talk, I don't know, maybe the next 45 minutes or something, I really don't want you to just listen to me. I really want you to think. And I want you to think, okay, how does this relate to me? I know that we have some people in physics, biochemistry, chemistry, communication, sociology, economics. There's a wide variety of people in here, and so we all have different interests. But we can all do research that interests us. Sometimes we get with an advisor and we feel obligated and guilty if we don't follow our advisor and things like that. But right now, I want you to be free to think, what interests you? What topic are you most interested in? If it's chemistry, what about chemistry is interesting to you? If it's economics, what about economics is interesting to you? And really kind of formulate this as if you were a sole researcher that could do whatever you wanted. You had endless resources to do that. In determining your topic, kind of that bigger heading, is it interesting? It better be interesting to you because you're going to spend a lot of time and effort thinking about it and doing it. Is it researchable? You probably talked about things that, it might be interesting to us, but it doesn't really need any research. Is it important? Is it ethical? Did y'all talk about ethics today? Okay, so we know kind of what ethical research is. And then is it manageable for you given your current skills, your resources, your time? And, as a college student, one of the benefits that you have is that you might not have all of those skills right now, but you can take a class in it and you can learn from someone that is an expert in that field. And so think about that also and the opportunities that you have, especially through this program, to really partner with somebody and learn a lot about these things that you're interested in. So once you have your topic, now think about, well, what are the problems within my topic? Not with your topic, not what's the problem with my topic, but within your topic, what are some questions that maybe haven't quite been answered yet? Or based on some experiences that you've had, or some observations, or maybe some patterns that you're noticing and you're not really understanding what's guiding those or why is that happening. Those are some things that can help us to identify the problem that actually needs to be studied, because research, in a nutshell, solves the problem. But it's guided through this method, through this process of what am I doing, why am I doing it, how am I doing it. So take a few minutes and think about what is a topic that you are interested in, and maybe why are you interested in it, what excites you about it, and what could a topic be, what could a problem be that you would study. Okay, would somebody care to share, what is your topic? What are you interested in? Chemistry reactions related to medicine. And what's a problem that needs to be studied there?
So we're trying to make drugs that are non-synthetic starting materials.
Okay, so trying to make drugs of non-synthetic materials?
Using like amino acids, like natural things.
Okay. So that's a very hands-on type of research where you're going to have to pull together some different elements and things like that and really see what is happening with that. What else? What's another topic?
Mine's different immigration policies affect the families.
Okay, how do different immigration policies affect families, and what's the problem there?
What positive and negative but for me, I feel like immigration affects families.
Okay, so the problem with that, there's a lot of different things that have to do with the connection between immigration and how it relates to families. But the focus that you are interested in is how it sometimes separates families, and that's a problem. It's a problem for, people in both of the situations. Good. Okay, one more. Here.
Fertilizing can make algae bloom more into the body of water.
Okay, so how algae blooms in bodies of water, and what's the problem with that?
The more fertilizers that go on algae, it grows faster, which takes oxygen out of the water, which fish and plants cannot live.
Okay, so kind of the effects of it's not just the algae in the water, but then how that affects the fish in the water. Good. So we see this big topic that we're interested in, and then we kind of dig into based on our experiences and what we've observed in different things. There is a problem with something. We can always find a problem with what we're dealing with. Some things I want to caution you at this point, whenever you think about stating that problem, that research problem, is using certain words. Some words in the research world have very specific meanings that tend to be, unfortunately, be used a little loosely. So one of those is correlation. How many of y'all have heard correlation? Okay? So sometimes we loosely use it to talk about a relationship between different things. But in the quantitative world, correlation has a very specific meaning. It has an associated formula, and then I can actually quantify with a number the level of correlation. So when we talk loosely about there's a correlation between this thing and this thing, or that and this, then it's not really using its proper word. Use the word relationship. We think there is a relationship between something. But when you use that word correlation, it needs to have an actual number associated with it in order to quantify the type of relationship and the strength of that relationship. Another one is significant. What is significant? If I say, oh, that's significant, what does that mean to you? It's important. Important is a better synonym when we're using it loosely, especially in the beginning stages of research when we're stating a problem or something like that. Because significant is another word, especially in the quantitative realm, that has a number associated with it. So significance deals with the probability that something happened by chance. So actually, if in my quantitative world, if we say something is significant, that means that 95% of the time that same thing is going to happen, and it's not just by chance that my data produced those results. So significant is a really, really important word, and we like to use it because we like our data to be significant, but it doesn't always happen. So we have to be really careful with using it so that we use it in the right context. Another one is prove, because prove implies 100% certainty, right? And in the quantitative and in the qualitative world, we don't ever really prove something 100% all of the time. Like I said, we can talk about the significance of it and the probability that it happens by chance or that it'll happen again if we replicate the study, but it's almost never 100% of the time. And the last one is cause. So sometimes we do a study and then maybe even in the algae thing, we say that the effects of the algae is causing the fish to die. Now it might be true, and we might think that based on what we're observing, but there are specific criteria that have to be met in order for us to use that specific word. That's a special word for us in research, that we have to have met certain steps in order to say that relationship is a causal relationship. Otherwise, there might just be some correlation. question. For instance, the temperature causes people to buy more snow cones. It's not that the temperature is causing it, but there is some influence there. If we looked at the temperature and we looked at, say, high, but we can't say that that alone is actually causing it. There are other things that have to be met in order to make that word mean something for us. And then I'll also talk about variables at this point, because when we think about our topic, whether it be chemistry or immigration or something like that, and then we talk about the problem, and that's going to lead us to our actual research question, which is going to drive our research and tell us what is important, what it is we're studying. And so that all involves different variables. And typically, if you're more of in a science field, like the algae and the fish or the medicine, you're going to be talking about variables, things that you can actually measure, that you can quantify, you can observe. Other people might also include some constructs. And there's a difference in a construct and a variable. So for instance, if we want to know what is the effect of immigration on families, how might you go about studying that?
Maybe analyzing how children act.
Okay, so how do children act when they're affected by the different immigration rules? And maybe we want to look at their level of happiness. So we're observing their happiness. Can I actually observe happiness? What can I observe? Smiling. That's a variable. What else? Frowning. That's a variable. What else? Body language. So are they laughing? Maybe we even have them fill out a survey that says rate your happiness, and we have a number. Those things that we can quantify and I can observe in some way are variables. But those things that we can't observe, that maybe we use some other variables to measure, those are called constructs. So it's important that we know what is a variable and what is a construct. What can I observe directly and measure directly, and what is it that I'm trying to use some other things in order to quantify that unobserved construct. It's the same thing whenever you're in class and maybe you take a test in science. So I can't observe your knowledge of science, but you can take a test where you respond to some items, you write an essay, and then I can grade your responses as variables to measure that construct. So it's important to keep those two things kind of separated and really know what the important variables and constructs are in your research. So once we know our topic, once we know our problem, we think we know what specific question we want to ask, but we need to know, has anybody else studied that before? There's probably been some research on the effects of immigration on families. There's probably been some research on the way that we are making medicine, the chemicals behind it, the way it's breaking down. There's probably been research on fish and streams and algae and all those things. So we're not the only ones who recognize these problems. And a lot of other problems have already been solved before us. So we need to do a literature review to really specify how is my research going to contribute to the field, and also maybe fill in a gap that hasn't been filled before. So the purpose is to determine what's been done already, provide information so you don't unintentionally duplicate existing research. That was one of the things I was most worried about when writing a dissertation, is I thought I had this great question that I wanted to answer, and I just kept thinking, what if somebody else has done it? What if somebody else has done it? And it's almost like, a rabbit chase through literature review, because, you read one journal article and you see everybody that they've cited, so you go read those, and then you read those who they cited, and you really try to figure out, and at some point you just have to stop and say, I don't think it's been done. I think this really is a gap in the research. But it also provides a framework for you to build upon. So think about your literature review as, you're about to build a house. You're about to build this big research project, whether it's an undergrad or it's your thesis or your dissertation or something. You're going to build a house, and you need a really strong foundation. You don't want any holes in it. You want it to be fairly new. You didn't want your foundation from the 1800s. And so you have to think really about, what are you going to lay down on the bottom? What journals are you going to look at? Are they reputable journals? Who are the authors that are writing those papers, and when were they written? There's a lot of things to consider. I mean, Wikipedia is a lot better than it used to be. We can go to USA Today, and even a lot of magazines have studies out there, but we really need some reputable, strong, peer-reviewed articles and studies to build our house on. So a good literature review, it demonstrates underlying assumptions critical to your research. So it really defines those assumptions. It demonstrates that the researcher is knowledgeable about related research. So maybe the topic that you're interested in, we don't want to put blinders on when we start to do our literature review, and we don't want to get just really stuck in what we're doing, because we know that there's a whole field around us that's also working and affecting our situation. And we need to be knowledgeable to know how those other things, what are the other things that are affecting the fish. And maybe we get into studying the algae and we realize, oh my goodness, not only is it affecting the fish, but it's affecting this and this and this. And it gets a little bit bigger, and we have to kind of rein it in. But we can't get blinded to the other things around us. We need to be knowledgeable in the related research around us. And one of the main things that research does is it fills the gap. My advisor kept saying, what gap are you filling? What gap are you filling? I saw this had been done over here and this had been done over here, but there was nothing in the middle. There was no overlap between those two, and there needed to be. And so I tried to pull those two things together and provide that bridge between two things. Whenever you write a literature review, just writing it sometimes is a little bit difficult because, there is a lot of information. So steps to doing a good literature review. The first thing is really to look at a list of keywords, and that could get really long, but think about all of the terms that might be related to your research. And you've already identified some in the topic and in the problem, but then if you think about synonyms of those, maybe terms that you use, but somebody else uses a different term to describe the same thing. Whenever you kind of have this collection of keywords, keep track of how you use those words, and what are some ways that you guys might use a search engine. What search engines do you use? Google. What? Google Scholar, yes. The library database. Those are the two that I use most often. Google Scholar and the library database. And so, we can look at, and I think that you talked about, you can use a single keyword, and then you can put two together, or you can put three together, you can use four. Try to keep track of maybe a checklist of how you use those, so that next week you don't think, oh, did I do that? And then you start repeating yourself and you go around in circles and waste time. So try to keep track of how you're using your different searches and your keywords so that you kind of manage your time well. The sources that you use, I'll kind of mention those. Those are really important. Those peer-reviewed journal articles are going to probably be the most important. Other dissertations and theses that have been done or that have been published. But then you kind of know in your field, maybe there are some research reports that you go into, or some organizations that do their own research, and you look at some things that they've put out. quality of your sources is important. And once you feel like, okay, this is everything, abstract your sources, review, summarize, classify them. I can remember my advisor, this was like before the days of a lot of computer power that we have today, and they would literally, each article had an index card, and my advisor said on the wall, like he would tape index cards to group, okay, these are kind of similar, and then these are kind of similar. And we kind of do the same thing with technology in Word or the way that we group, but trying to keep it organized. I made a spreadsheet that had the author and the year, and then if it included certain, then I had a column for each of my variables, and I would check mark, okay, this article did this keyword, and this article did these two keywords. And that's kind of how I kept track of where I still needed more literature and where I was pretty thorough and things like that. Once we have all that done, so we have our topic, we know a problem, and now we know everything in and of and around that problem, now we can define our own research question. So before we do that, I want you to take out your little paper again, and in step 2, obviously you don't really know what's been done yet, but I do want you to go ahead and think about what are some of your keywords. And I know you won't answer all of these, but I want you to think about your keywords, and then on the back, as of right now, what would you say is the gap that you would fill with a research study that you're thinking about? So your keywords and your gap. Think about those. Give you maybe 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm interested in the gap. Somebody share with me the gap that you think that your research would fill. Maybe somebody different this time. No gaps? Okay, keywords. Step back. What are keywords that you guys thought that were related to your topic and your problem? Oh, come on. Help me out. I know, that's okay. Come on, help me out. What are some keywords? What? Neurological. Okay, what's one more that goes with that? Stroke. Okay? So neurological and stroke, we're going to look at those things in different journals, maybe even looking at the faculty that are Oklahoma State. Who else studies neurological things? Who else studies strokes? And it might be somebody from psychology, and it might be somebody through, we don't have med school, one of the sciences, biochemistry, yeah. Okay, one other person, what are some keywords? I don't mind awkward silence, which isn't always a good thing. What are y'all interested in? Say it again. Grant Unified Theories. What is that? Physics. Okay, I know physics. I don't know your specific, and that's okay. You and your neighbor might have completely different research interests, but as long as it interests you, that's what's fun about it. Thank you for sharing. So we take our keywords, we think we've identified this gap, and then we can develop our research question. So if we think about building this house, okay, my literature review just laid my foundation. And my research question, or my research questions, because sometimes there's more than one, these are my blueprints. These are going to guide everything else. How we build the house, what we use to build the house, everything about the house will be built off of the research question and the hypotheses. So your research question includes those variables or the constructs that you're interested in, and it describes the relationships among them. So we're talking about strokes and neurology. What is the relationship that my question is seeking to answer related to those things? And I'll say this, sometimes we have these grand ideas and our research question becomes a paragraph. Have y'all seen that? Because we get excited about our research. Break it up. Have one research question and then part A, part B, part C. Really tone it down so that with a single sentence, you can answer this research question. And with a single sentence, you can answer that research question. It's okay to have multiple research questions, and I would say better than having one research question that is a compound sentence with 3 objectives or something like that. And then based on your research question, you answer it with a hypothesis based on what everybody else has done. Now, obviously, you don't know for sure because hopefully nobody else has answered your question before. But your hypothesis needs to be guided by, and you'd say, so-and-so studied a similar variable, maybe not the separation effects of immigration and families, but a different aspect of that, and this is what happened. Or another person looked at a different aspect of this, or maybe applied a different type of analysis, but studied the same context, and you think, I can study that better using a different type of analysis. And so you pull those things in to support what you're doing and formulate a hypothesis. So your hypotheses are used to state the relationship between, I say 2 variables because, sometimes, like I said, we get complex in our research questions. It's okay to say, are males more likely to whatever than females? And to compare 2 groups, and then we can provide a very clear answer to that. It can be a non-directional or directional, but it's really important that we talk about the direction of our relationships, how we think one thing is going to influence. Is it going to be positive? Is it going to be negative? Or maybe we don't know how it's going to affect, but we need to state even that in our hypotheses. So the next part is the planning. So for me, this is the fun part. Data. I like the statistics. I like the method process of research. And so these are kind of the 4 main components that we really need to think about whenever we are planning our research study. And I would say one of the most important, because you don't want to spend all this time and all these resources on the research and get done and say, oh, I didn't include, for me, I would say, I forgot to include this one question in my survey that I just administered to 2,000 people, and that was the key piece. That's what I needed to know. Or you don't want to get through everything that you've done and think, I wish I would have also done this. It's not a one and done. Research isn't one and done. Maybe you'll be doing research for the rest of your life. Who knows? I didn't think I would, but here I am. But I enjoy it. It's fun, and I like continuing to learn and being a lifelong learner. And I think it's interesting, but I've learned a lot of things along the way, and this is definitely one of them. The planning process is really important. So if you're dealing, for me, I deal with people, participants. Who is the population, the sample, characteristics of the sample, and how big is that sample going to be? So for me, I'm thinking, who is the larger group that I'm going to be able to select from? So maybe it's college students. Well, I can't gather all college students across America and give them this survey. But I can randomly select some that I know at Oklahoma State, or I can give it to my own students who can then give it to their friends. And I know somebody at the University of Arkansas, and they can administer it to some students at the University of Arkansas, and things like that. So the way that we sample our respondents is really important. But you might not be dealing with people. How many of y'all think my participants aren't actually people? Okay? Medicine, maybe fish. And that's okay. Think about what are some characteristics specifically of the respondents or the participants that you need. So for me, I'm thinking about their age, their demographics, their gender, which field of study that they're in. But maybe it's a specific kind of fish or a specific size of fish, or maybe it's these various different types of chemicals, and one might do this and one might do that. But thinking about all of the details of the sample that you intend, now you might not get it all, but in an ideal world, what is going to be fully representative of your sample? And the next one is your instruments, your tools to collect your data. How are you going to measure the different things? So for me, I need a survey. I need an instrument that is going to have questions specific to the construct that I want to measure. But you have a different instrument because you know what your variables are. You know how you're going to measure these different neurological things. You know how you're going to measure different chemicals, and you'll need different instruments than I need. But we need to make sure that we choose the right instrument to measure the variables or the constructs that are part of our research. In the design and the procedure portion, and so you can even think of this part as like if you were writing a paper and you have this method section, there would hopefully be at least these 4 subsections of your participants, and you describe them, and your instruments, and you describe them, and your design and procedure, and you describe your plan of what you think you're going to do. How will you access the sample? How will the data be managed? Some of you may have to keep your data on lock and key because it is under contract or it's being funded by a grant or something like that. Those are some things to think about. And you also think about the timeline. So you know that you're in this program for this amount of time. Where along that timeline will you start gathering your data? Will you hopefully finish gathering and you'll start analyzing your data? And when do you hope to have it finished? Really putting out a timeline is important, not only for you, but for the other people to know the expectations that you're working with of what you plan to do. And you can also there, though, identify your limitations. Usually we do this at the very, very end, right? So we have that last paragraph of a paper that might say, unfortunately, this study didn't do X, Y, and Z. But, you know, it really is okay to put it here just as a reminder to yourself that you're not out to solve the world with this one research study. There are going to be limitations to this one research study, but you'll do it next time. So if it just helps you out, which it helps me out, to say, okay, I know I'm not doing it this time, but maybe next time we will change it up just a little bit. And then the last one is data analysis, and this will look different for the qualitative people and for the quantitative people, depending on what kind of data you have. But you really need to not only talk about and say, I'm going to run a t-test or an ANOVA or whatever type of statistical analysis, but provide your justification. It's really important for you to justify, and you know, your advisor knows, people around you know, what you're doing. But when it gets published and somebody sees your name on the article, they're going to want to know, did that person really know what they were doing? And if right here you justify and you say, I did this analysis because my variables were quantitative and I had 2 groups, so I did a t-test or something like that, it's going to give you or your readers some respect for you to say, okay, I see they're not leaving anything out, they're not trying to fake it till they make it, they really know what they're doing and covering all their bases in writing this paper. You would also include your software, and there is qualitative software out there, so that's not just a limiting factor. But it is important, especially in the quantitative world, to talk about your software because different ones may handle things differently. So I want to talk about the population and the sample just a little bit more because that's really important. How many people will deal with people? Okay, so think about the demographics of the population that you have. And so in an ideal world, if you could get everybody that was important to your study, what would that population look like? Where would they be located? What would the characteristics be? Now we know that you probably won't get to sample all of them, but you want to generalize to all of them. You want to select a group of them and work through your research study, but then hopefully your conclusion will generalize to that bigger group. So it's important to know all the characteristics of that population. And before you get to that sample, how do you go from population to sample? That's what we call sampling. And sampling is the process of selecting individuals from the larger group representative of your group. And there's a lot of different ways to sample. Give me an example. Like if I wanted to sample college students, what would be a way that from the population of OSU undergraduate students, I could get a sample of 100?
Psychology students.
Okay, so I'm just going to choose the psychology students and maybe partner up with one of the faculty members and sample the students in their classroom. Good. Now, that sample right there would miss business students, and it would miss some people over in agriculture. So if that's what I'm doing, I need to make sure that that's really the only people I'm trying to generalize to. So how might you get a more diverse sample if I want some more diversity in that?
Just randomly generate something. You say you get a list of all the students currently enrolled, just randomly generate.
Okay.
There's 100 people there, like, hey, you're in the study, go ahead and not get kicked out of school.
Right. Okay, so that right there is the ideal way of sampling. It's that we have a full list of the population, maybe we number them, and then we generate a random 100 numbers and we pick those from the population. That's what we call simple random sampling, and it's a sampling in a way that every single person in the population at least had a chance to take part in my study. It didn't leave anybody out. Ideally, that's what we would do. But unfortunately, we don't really get that luxury. It's really hard to get the listserv and the email addresses of every undergraduate student. That's really hard. But props if you can. What would be another way?
Money.
Money. Okay, how so?
If you do this study, I'll give you $5.
If you do this study, you provide an incentive. So that's more on, okay, I'm asking you to be a part of my sample, but I'm going to incentivize you to actually participate, because there's a difference between sampling and maybe with your method, the ideal method, I say, okay, you 100 are the chosen ones to be a part of my study. Maybe only 25 of them actually show up though.
So tell them they're getting kicked out of school if they don't show up.
So your incentive is getting kicked out of school and your incentive is getting $5.
Like, this would so bias people. They'd be like, well, if I don't need $5, and you're gonna you can't generalize to economic status as well.
Oh, okay. So I see a research study here of what's the best incentive when sampling college students. That's a pretty good one, I think. There's a lot of things to think about. Give me one more. What's another way that we could collect a sample of college students?
Just throw a flyer out somewhere with a lot of people like you would be perfect.
Good. Maybe stand out in front of the union and you hand out a flyer and we're trying to get a sample of people. That's what, I don't know if I have it up here. That is a convenient sample. So it was convenient for me to stand out and hand out a flyer and ask you to participate in my study. Now, that's probably the way that most samples are collected. But and we think, the union's a pretty busy place. There's probably thousands of students that come by there. All of them are OSU undergraduate students. But are there some people who probably never went by the union?
Maybe like way out there.
Right. So maybe somebody who is a vet student who only hangs out over in the vet area. Maybe we don't ever get a sample of them. What even about those who are only taking online classes? And then think about this. think about the demographics of those people who are only taking online classes and how they might be different from those who you see at the union. What would be some different characteristics?
Probably major with bigger majors. Because you need the larger major to justify having online course.
Okay, so they have to be in a major that at least offers, a lot of online classes. What did you say? They're going to most likely be a non-traditional student, whereas if you stick out in front of the union, you're probably getting just traditional students. And so we think about, okay, now how does that characteristic of my sample differ from the population, or how is my specific sample going to be different in those subgroups of people? Because maybe if it's what is your satisfaction with taking classes at Oklahoma State, that's going to be different in those different contexts. So just thinking through, we can talk about that all day. How are you going to gather a sample that is best representative of your population so that when you do all this work and you make a conclusion, you can actually generalize to the bigger group? And when we do that generalization, so we have our population, we sample from it to get our sample, and then in the end, when we try to go back to a conclusion about the population, that's what we call inferences. So inferential statistics is something that you might hear about, and that's when we take our sample data and go back to trying to make a conclusion about the population. Unfortunately, though, there's always some error in our sampling. So sampling error is a chance variation that occurs when a sample doesn't represent the population. Think about even, is there a chance if we had the entire listserv of OSU students and we wanted to do something that generalized to everybody, I select 100 people. Is there a chance that all 100 are female? Yeah. Well, I did the perfect sampling method, which I thought was perfect, and I still didn't get the representative sample. That would be sampling error. It was completely out of your control. Now, there are ways you could have controlled it. So you could have looked at your list and then you could have divided it male, female, select 50% and 50%. So that would be a stratified sample. But we could go, all the way down to the nitty gritty to where you're almost hand-picking people, and then we've lost that randomization. So there's a balance in those things, but again, things to consider when you are sampling. Other sources of error, something created a bias in your data. If you're talking, for instance, what's your satisfaction at OSU? And what if, we planned all this, we were doing our study this week, and what if last week something tragic had happened on campus and we weren't expecting it? That's obviously going to influence, your research study. There are sometimes some things that happen that you have to take into account that are going to cause some error or bias. It's just something that needs to be acknowledged. If you choose a bad instrument, so for instance, for me, if I choose, I want to measure students' levels of depression who are affected by immigration, and instead my instrument actually measures anxiety. Well, depression is related to anxiety, but that's not what I wanted to measure. Or if you're using a beaker in chemistry and the levels are off, if you look at it wrong or something like that. Instruments have, the opportunity to be used incorrectly. So we have to acknowledge that and try not to use it wrongly. There's always chances that we record our data wrong, we perform the wrong analysis, or even that your participants don't interact with you the way that you think that they're going to. Maybe it's cheating if it's on a test, or maybe you do some manipulation in treatment groups and then they leave and they all talk about it and then come back and are responding differently because of their conversations outside of the actual treatment. So some things you just can't control, but we have to acknowledge them and try to create an environment so that our study is as good as possible. So once we have our questions, our literature review. We have a full plan in place. Now we can start actually building our house. But sometimes we have to go through some codes of conduct and things like that just to verify. And I think that you guys talked about some academic integrity things already today. Y'all talk about IRB. Okay, so this is the point. This is like the yield sign. You got to get IRB approval a lot of times in order to actually collect your data and do your research. But there's so much on the front end before you actually get your hands dirty in research. So it's important to really follow those processes and procedures on the front end. Okay, so we'll time out here and now jump to step 4 with the planning and methods section. Some of you are dealing with people, some of you are dealing with other types of things, but I want you to think through just for a bit, who would your population be? Ideally, your results would generalize to what group, or what place, or what things? How would you select a sample? What are characteristics? Just think through some of those questions. Okay, so we'll keep going here. Now, if we think about building our house, we have a foundation, we have a blueprint, we have the plan for everything we're going to do. We have okay that we can start building. And so we're at this point that we can start collecting our data. So we have to think about, well, how am I going to do that? Like I said, I deal with people in the College of Education, Health, and Aviation. We typically deal with people, but there are ways, I know some of you guys don't do that. So you just think about, how are you going to collect your data? What does that look like for you? What kinds of observations are you going to make? Maybe you still have focus groups, but maybe you look at some documents and some records and you're reading a lot of things like that. There's a lot of different forms of data, but how are you going to collect it? If you're dealing with people, and we think about giving surveys, and then a lot of other things too, if it's an experiment, we may not be guaranteed that every one of our trials is going to work. So in the front end, we need to think, how many people are actually going to respond? If I need 100 responses from people, maybe I need to try to get 200 people and hand out at least 200 flyers. A goal is a 60% response rate when we do surveys. It's actually really hard to get people to respond to a survey. I don't know if you've done survey research or handed out flyers or anything like that, but it's really hard. So think of being an overachiever when you go to collect responses, because it's likely that you might not hit that goal. And it's not your fault, it's just our fault, because we're inundated all the time with respond to this, respond to that, respond to this, and sometimes we just, kind of get burnt out on it. How many of you guys have had a statistics course? Anybody? Just a few of you, okay? So you've all had math, though, obviously. Statistics are a little bit different, I think, than mathematics. A lot of people come to my class and they're like, I hate math, I've never been good at math, I'm going to fail this class. And it's just different. I don't know how to describe it. Statistics are much more applied because you're actually working with some numbers that have something to do with what you're interested in, and you're trying to answer this research question. It's true that we have to use some mathematical equations and formulas and things like that to analyze the data, but I think it's pretty fun to do some statistics. Some of our stats that you'll calculate are specific to your sample. So you'll calculate means and standard deviations, and you might make a pie chart or a bar graph or something like that. And those are specific to your sample. But then probably a goal of your research is not just to tell the world about your sample, but to make some observations about your sample so that you can generalize to some bigger population, or so that you can generalize to, if this was done again, then this would happen. And that's what we call inferences. And we can put a number to like the probability of determining how likely the results in your specific sample are true in the population. So if somebody were to replicate your study, what's the chance that they would get the same results? Hopefully that's high, but it all depends on your planning and your methods and how well you did that. Choosing the analysis. If you've had a statistics course, some of these things might look familiar. If you haven't, that's okay too. In the quantitative world, at least, I just provide this to you so that, you know, whenever you get into the statistics, it's not just this big toolbox of tools and you look at it and you think, I don't know what to do with all this data. And there's, you know, if I'm using some software like SPSS or SAS, it says I have all these options and I don't know what those options are doing. Well, this is kind of a flow chart, and a lot of times you can think methodologically through this. So how many dependent variables do you have? I give you the options of one because that's the most simple, and a lot of times we do. Are your variables categorical or continuous? So did you put people into, and did you measure in terms of a group, categories and certain things, or is it some continuous measure like height or weight or something like that that has a continuous measure? And then we think about how many dependent or independent variables did you have? Did you have one? Or did you have two or more? So you walk through this, and this is why your research question is so important in the way that you define your variables, because the number of variables and the kind of variables and then the relationship between those variables that you want to study, all of those things will walk you through, well then what type of analysis do I need to do? So the more details you put on the front end, the less stressful the statistics side of it is. I'm going to guess that most of you aren't that anxious and worried when it comes to statistics. But if you are, there's a lot of people that are, and I would say don't be discouraged by it, because there's a ton of people, your advisors, you have classes here, there's resources online that can really help you out in the things that you don't know. And that's true with all the steps of research. If you don't know how to do it, somebody does, especially here at OSU. So you have a really good opportunity to learn a lot of things while you're here and get a good skill set so that whenever you do leave, you'll have the skills that you need. So then the last step is the results and the conclusions. So your results, you report your descriptive statistics about your sample, you give a narrative, so you don't just want a bunch of tables and then say the end. You have to actually tell, that's what I would do as a quantitative person, I just let the numbers speak for themselves. But we do have to write a little bit about them and kind of let them tell a story. What did you find out? This was true about my sample. And so I'm going to infer from my sample that this is going to happen in the population. But we still acknowledge that we did have some limitations and we can only generalize within our boundaries. But then it's also good to think about the implications of your research in the real world. So sometimes we collect all this data and then we get stuck in the numbers. And we can even talk about means and standard deviations and make some graphs and charts and things like that. But it's important at the very, very end especially to step back and say, now how is that impacting the world? Because I didn't just do all of this so that it could stay in a computer and I could have fun with analyzing data and making pretty graphs. But you did it so that you could impact the world, so you could answer questions, so you could fill a gap. So it's really important that the conclusion of your research goes back to what excited you about this in the first place, and how are you going to share this with the world in a way that they can also understand it. So this is just an outline I think you've talked about. How do you even put all this together in a paper? You do all this work and then you have to write a 20, 25-page manuscript to submit to a journal and pray that it gets reviewed well. I would say don't be discouraged by rejection. Just take it as a challenge and you keep on going. But it has just all those pieces that we've talked about as headings, where you have the intro, the lit review, the method, result, conclusion, and then your references at the end. And you really take this outline, and that's another reason that I gave this to you, is not only for you to kind of brainstorm through it, but use this as a guide even whenever you write your paper. And use these headings and fill in the gaps with your paragraphs of what you're doing. So that's all that I have. As I learned about your program, I'm really excited for you. I think it's an awesome opportunity that you guys have to get to partner with a faculty member and to do some research. So I'm excited for you. If you have questions, I mean, your faculty are your experts by all means. But if you do have other questions or you want to talk through anything else, feel free to contact me. My email address is hi.cole@OK State. My office is over in Willard, teaching summer classes, so I'll be here this summer too. But I really wish you all the best of luck and hope that you really take advantage of this opportunity that you have in the research and to leave your mark with the research that you do. So thank you so much.